Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. I'm Hank Paulson. I'm co-chair of the Risky Business Project, and I'm very pleased to be joined on the dais today with my fellow Risk Committee members for this project. We've just completed a study which calculates and quantifies the various climate risks to our economy. And this is, I think, noteworthy. It's the first time this has been done. I have had a fair amount of experience over my career in attempting to understand and manage risk. And as I think many of you know, in 2008, I was the Treasury Secretary when a failure of risk management led to the 2008 financial crisis. Today, we are facing another looming crisis, and although it's not financial in nature, it still has a very significant economic threat to our economy. As a matter of fact, in many ways, the threat from the climate bubble is actually more cruel and more perverse, because as I think many of you know, that when CO2 goes into the atmosphere, it stays there for many, many years. It's cumulative. And so there is no possibility for the government to come in with action at the last minute and prevent the very worst outcomes. Now, the study, which you will hear about today, identifies an overwhelming number of risks. And a big value of the study is the risk management perspective it brings. We use well understood risk management methodologies that the businesses generally apply to managing their risks. So I think this is a very valuable aspect of the study. Now, as I said, it identifies a large number of risks. Many of these are already baked into the economy, but the good news is that if we act immediately, we can avoid the very worst outcomes. So a huge takeaway here is that taking a cautious approach, waiting for more information, a business as usual approach, is actually radical risk-taking. Because if you do this, you give us no opportunity to avoid the very most adverse outcomes. All we can do is adapt to them. So it's very important that the government and business act soon. And here I would emphasize the very important role that business has. I've worked with CEOs and businesses all around the world. I don't mean to sound parochial, but I think American companies are the best managed in the world. In many industries, we're the leaders, and we need to lead. American business needs to lead in this area. We need to take out an insurance policy. It's just that simple. Why the investment decisions that American companies are making today will have a lot to do with our economic future. So on that note, it's now my honor to turn it over to my friend and Risky Business co-chair, Mayor Michael Bloomberg.
Well, thank you, Hank. We've always had a saying, which I'm sure you all really, if you think about it, would agree with: if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And that's why every business periodically conducts a comprehensive risk analysis to assess their vulnerabilities, whether they're financial or climate or anything else. But until today, we've had no ways to measure the serious risks to our national economy that it faces from climate change. And businesses and investors have largely been kept in the dark about how climate change will impact specific industries or specific regions, and that puts American businesses and the American economy in an extremely vulnerable position. This Risky Business report outlines climate risk by region and by industry, and it puts a concrete dollar figure on those risks for the first time. And this is critical information for businesses and investors to have as they plan for the future, and it makes the true cost of inaction on climate change frighteningly clear. Our report shows that the longer we wait to adapt to and mitigate climate change, the more devastating the economic impacts will be. And Hank, I thought, described that very well. We just cannot afford to wait another minute because climate change is costing local governments and businesses billions of dollars, and no competent executive is going to walk away from thinking about what could happen and taking appropriate actions if that were to occur. We saw firsthand what can happen in New York City with Hurricane Sandy, and while we can't say that any one storm was caused by climate change, there's no question that rising sea levels and ocean temperature made Sandy worse, and that they make extreme weather more frequent. There's also no question that New York City is far from alone in being vulnerable to extreme weather. Our analysis shows within just the next 15 years, annual damages to states on the East Coast and along the Gulf Coast could reach up to something like $35 billion. Now, in other parts of the country, more frequent and severe heat waves have threatened public health and impacted labor productivity. In some states with large agricultural industries, it will literally be too hot and humid to safely work outside for many days of the year, and that will drive food costs up and put our energy grid under tremendous stress. It's also true that some crops that we've grown here won't be able to grow when the climate changes, and you can see that in the forests where insects that are destroying the forest usually used to get killed off in cold weather, and now they're not getting killed off, and the number of trees that are brown and just in our big forests is really scary. It's also true that if you go and look at glaciers, and a friend of mine sent me an email yesterday from Alaska, it's just frightening how far back the glaciers have melted just in the last 5 or 10 years. We have to plan for risks, and we have to take every possible step to avoid them. Climate change is one of them. And considering the tremendous losses American businesses will suffer if we do nothing to slow climate change, and how much of those losses can be avoided by smart, prudent, rapid action, American businesses, we think, should lead the charge, and we hope this report will mobilize the business community and forge consensus for national action across the aisle. And we'll continue working with leaders from the business community to urge Congress to make that happen, and to urge other business leaders with their own companies to make that happen, because every city, every company, every state, and the federal government all can do something to make a big difference here. Hank, thank you.
Okay, Tom?
Hi, good morning. This study is basically about quantifying reality. The American business community has always been terrific at facing up to reality, at searching for sound data, analyzing it, and using it to inform decision-making and making risk-reward decisions. And Risky Business has tried to take that straightforward American framework and apply it to the problem of climate change. What we found is the risks are significant, and that some regions of the country and some business sectors face a disproportionate share of those risks. We believe that climate risk is something that should be taken into account by every business and every investor, depending on their very specific situation. And I think we all are confident that American business people and entrepreneurs can find ways to mitigate and manage climate risk once they're fully aware of their circumstances. But more than that, we really need the business community to be an advocate for a level playing field so that we can address these risks. Climate is really bigger than, the climate risk is bigger than any one part of the country or any one business. When I think about what business does, basically business people do calculations to try and figure out what the impacts are going to be of future actions. And to solve climate change, we really need to change the spreadsheet for American business when they're doing those calculations. We need to reward people whose behavior reduces climate risk and penalize people who add to it. If we can get this right, I think there's no doubt that our economy is going to continue to do really well, and that American entrepreneurs and business people are going to keep us on a steady path to a very healthy, growing economy and a very sound natural environment. Thanks.
Next, Donna Shalala, the former Secretary of HHS and who gets to look at climate on a first-hand basis down in Miami.
I live in one of those high-risk areas in South Florida, and in fact, the future prosperity of Florida is inextricably connected to the sun and the sea. We have a climate-driven economy, and for us, this report is absolutely critical. We're on the front line. We're already feeling the effects of climate change. Non-weather-related flooding caused by sea level rise in our community, devastating storm surges on coast and inland flooding, saltwater intrusion into freshwater areas, and rising costs to develop and to insure property. The good news is that there is evidence that the communities along the coast, particularly in South Florida, are beginning to take steps to mitigate the impact of climate change. We've got more accurate flood zoning maps to determine the threats to life and property. We've used them to determine evacuation zones. We have better water management decisions and coordination between municipalities. We have tougher building codes to mitigate the effects of severe weather. But the bigger issues, we have a lot more to do. I believe that this country has the ingenuity, the resources, and the moral obligation to do much more. And in many ways, the communities that are most affected, their business communities, need to step up in every way. But the universities are also committed partners. The young people in this country get it, and they're our future business leaders. But we have to move before they get old enough to lead the business in the business community. And if you look at a university like mine, where we're studying every aspect of this, including architecture students trying to figure out how you would retrofit or build new for higher levels of water in our community, those kinds of studies, as well as the studies to determine more precisely the effects of hurricanes with all sorts of new devices, are going to make a difference in the future. We will develop the data in our great universities in this country. Managing it and providing the leadership, I believe, is very much the responsibility of the business community and those of us who run very large enterprises in this country. Thank you.
Okay, next, Bob Rubin, who also knows something about risk management, former Secretary of Treasury, who has the dubious distinction of being also my former boss.
It was dubious, actually. I think the following. I have come to believe that climate change is the existential issue of our age. I don't believe that we have a focus or an action in relation to it that is remotely commensurate with the risk that we face. I believe that if we don't effectively address climate change, that the effects can not only be severe, as pointed out in this report, and Tom referred to them as significant, but I believe they can be catastrophic. Greenhouse gases have a decay rate in the atmosphere of centuries, hundreds of years. What we do today will affect us for centuries. The report, as Tom said, does show significant effects, but I think significant vastly understates what we face, because if you look at that report, what you see is possible negative feedback loops, possible vicious cycles that are far from remote possibilities. I think they are very realistic possibilities that could lead to catastrophic effects. With that, I'd like to make 4 specific comments. One, I believe that investors should insist that companies disclose their exposure to climate risk, and that would include costs they may someday have to absorb in order to address carbon emissions. It includes the value of assets that could be stranded by future climate change measures and the actual impact that climate change could have. Then investors could make more fully informed decisions about risks, and I think it would also provide an incentive for business to act. Secondly, the investment and business communities can work to change the public conversation, and I think that's critical if we're going to get political action, and then also engage with the political sector in order to move forward on public policy, and public policy is absolutely key. Thirdly, climate change is very likely to create substantial future fiscal costs that have not been included in any current budgetary projections. The federal government has historically provided for natural disasters, has provided emergency relief with respect to health care and agricultural crises. Those are likely to be more frequent with climate change. As I said, that would increase very substantially fiscal costs, and there's no accounting for them in current projections. And finally, I believe that GDP, as currently measured, does not accurately reflect what's happening in the economy because it does not include the externalities like greenhouse gas emissions and the tremendous costs they could have. And a misguided measure of what's happening in our economy can lead to misguided policy.
Good. Next, Henry Cisneros, the former Secretary of HUD, who is also quite an expert on this topic.
Mr. Secretary, thank you. As former Secretary of Housing, traveled to 200 different American cities in every one of the 50 states, and for the last 20 years have been involved in real estate, I want to say a few words about the implications of climate change for one specific business sector, which is real estate. No business sector is more likely to be impacted by climate change than the real estate sector. When you think of it, real estate is anchored in physical geography, so it's tied to the physical reality of places. And it's driven by demand, which is to say where people want to live, where businesses grow. So there are a lot of people involved in that physical space. There are a number of ways, specific ways, in which climate change will impact real estate. And real estate leaders and investors need to be thinking about this. One is the reality that coastal properties and infrastructure are at the risk of inundation from rising seas and storm surge that accompanies hurricanes. These two forces, rising seas and hurricanes, when combined, put a significant amount of coastal property at risk in the United States. As the seas continue to rise, each storm will push water further inland, increasing the scale of the damages. So, as Donna said earlier, Miami faces a real danger, but it's not alone. Norfolk and our major naval facilities there. Houston, the world energy center that it is. Cities like Wilmington and Atlantic City, and of course in New York, we saw what the future may look like in the experience from Hurricane Sandy. And the storms are only likely to get worse. So developers, builders, and community leaders have to be cognizant of the implications of climate change. Other quick indications. Dry areas in the United States, the science tells us, will be drier, which means major implications for the western United States and its major cities. These are some of the fastest growth areas in the country, and they'll be faced with water shortages. We're already seeing permits being limited in particular states and for cities, which has implications then for where developers can build, where people can live, where growth will occur. California is allocating water from its state reservoirs for the first time in its history. Higher temperatures means higher energy costs, which means higher expenses for power generation. Again, economic development is shaped in part in our new economy by where power reserves are available. It means huge expenses for additional power given the need for massive air conditioning as temperatures rise in places that have not been that hot until now. Extreme temperatures also, as Mayor Bloomberg said, have productivity dimensions. That is to say, you can't work in construction the same hours in the same ways with extreme heat. It's just not possible to be on the roof of a house in Phoenix today, but when Phoenix temperatures are mirrored in multiple states across the country for more than a few days a year, but for months, it has massive implications for business. So it's important to look at these things and look at them from an economic perspective. Matters of insurance, for example, whether insurance can be gotten at all in coastal areas, changes the workings of our economy. It's important for people in the real estate sector to pay attention, and I think that's what this report tries to do for the first time, is cast climate change in terms that business people can be attentive. And it means involvement in paying attention to the science, but also being involved with the public sector organizations and the nonprofits that are beginning to think through what are the things that we can realistically do. Too often in American life, and I'll close with this point, people who think they're not directly involved sit on the sidelines until it's too late. The real estate sector is accustomed to sort of the business cycle and waits out the cycle. This is not about a cycle. This is a long-term game changer for the country and for an industry that, if it isn't paying attention, will be directly involved. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Henry. And now to my good friend Greg Page, the Executive Chairman of Cargill. And I would say there's no one in this country better positioned or more knowledgeable about understanding and the risks that the ag sector faces, and a lot of experience in dealing with farmers. Greg.
Thank you, Hank. Good morning. The value of the risky business conversation is that it will encourage us to think about what long-term actions we can take today that put us in the best position to be prepared for a variety of futures. If you're going to behave responsibly, and particularly in something as important as human nutrition, we need to have these conversations. Farmers have been on the front lines of adapting to changing conditions for centuries. But all the things that are challenging about producing food for a growing and more affluent population become even more interdependent when faced with the range of possible impacts of a changing climate. If we face a period of accelerated climate change, the question will quickly become whether the food system that we rely upon can adapt quickly enough. The work Risky Business is doing is contributing to an important discussion as it pertains to our ability to feed the world. This research shows the potential risks to agricultural production based on current farming practices and a range of projected changes in climate. Agriculture historically has been resilient. Going forward, this systemic resilience, where major stakeholders in the global food system are poised, able, and willing to build solutions to broad challenges in an effective and complementary way, will be critical. Society will need to rely on a global system that is sufficiently flexible to produce enough food despite localized disruptions. I am optimistic that we can meet the challenge. My optimism is rooted in the ingenuity of the world's farmers. They are natural innovators, adapting to changes in the environment and changes in technology, proven by their doubling of the amount of grains, rice, and oilseeds that they produce since 1975, and they have done this without a significant increase in the number of acres farmed. The incredible productivity of U.S. farmers and our ability to feed a growing human population is the result of investments and innovations that were undertaken 40 and 50 years ago. We have to be sure that we are not the generation that breaks that line. We don't want to be the people that underinvested in the practices and technology that not only make food reliable and available, but very importantly, affordable. A transition of this magnitude will have bumps in the road that are compounded by the uncertainties of a changing and evolving climate. So it is important that we start this conversation and our work now.
Greg, thank you. And now, last but not least, Al Sommer, the retired Dean of the Bloomberg School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins.
Retired but not retiring. Right, thanks very much.
That's for sure.
So there's an old joke that it's not the heat, it's the humidity. Well, for public health, it's both the heat and the humidity, because when it's humid outside and hot, your sweat can't evaporate. And when it can't evaporate, you can't regulate your core body temperature, and that leads to a dramatic increase in heat stroke and therefore deaths. As people have been mentioning, it's going to get a lot hotter in the United States over the next 100 years and worse going forward. Montana summers will soon be the same as New Mexico today. That's the reason why I'm vacationing in Montana this year and not putting it off. There will be 10 to 20 times as many incremental deaths because of excess heat and humidity by 100 years from now. But if we don't do something now, you can't turn it off later. And as my friend Henry Cisneros has said, labor productivity is going to go way down. Now, this is the average risky business, but as Bob Rubin has pointed out to us repeatedly, you really have to think about the tails as well. This is the average. This is the most likely outcome, and it's not good. The tails are the less likely horrendous outcomes, which will be much worse. And the reason we take out insurance against fire and floods and what have you is for those less likely events that eventually do happen and happen unexpectedly. And it will be too late to take out insurance for the whole United States once this is entirely baked into the system.
Thank you, Al. Matt, we're now going to take some questions from you, and Matt will moderate.
Thanks very much, Hank. So as I mentioned, we're going to do moderated Q&A. And for those of you who have technical questions, the report author is Kate Gordon, who's the executive director of the Risky Business Project, and Trevor Hauser, who's a principal with Rhodium Group, who did the underlying analysis, will be available for those questions. So just raise your hand, and we have some mic runners who will come and find you to take your questions. I think we have a question here in the front.
Hi, Christine Romans from CNN. Okay, Christine Romans from CNN. Thanks for coming and presenting this morning. How do you stress upon Wall Street and companies and executives who are under very significant quarter-by-quarter and year-by-year pressures to think about something that is longer term? How do you get them to innovate on this when they're answering to their shareholders in the very short term? Is it something that government has to do?
The issue you raised is a huge issue, and it's not limited to Wall Street, and it's not limited to U.S. companies or investors. It's short-termism. And, if you spend some time in Washington, you understand a little bit about short-termism also. So there's a tendency to focus on an immediate crisis. And I can just make the following points. First of all, as Bob Rubin said, this report attempts to quantify not just the most likely, but also look at the tails. And it seems to a number of us that these risks are going to be more immediate than science has been able to document. The science is still evolving. The science is, scientists extrapolate from historical data, and of course we're operating in a new paradigm right now with man-made CO2. So at least I believe that a couple of things. First of all, the risks are much more immediate and people are seeing them. So you're seeing them, you're going to continue to see these in adverse weather events. And I think that is going to increase the pressure. I think young people today, and so I think companies feel pressure from young people, from their customers, from their employees. But again, I will go back to what Bob said. I think it's a role of investors. It's perhaps the SEC should be requiring disclosures. There's a number of ways to create urgency, but this is not easy. That's why I said in my opening statement that this, in many ways, is the risks are much more perverse and cruel than we saw with the financial crisis, because they accumulate over time, and the longer we wait, the more difficult it becomes to deal with the most perverse risks.
I also think the long-term investors, those of us that manage pension funds, are going to have to sit up and take notice, because we don't live in a world in which we're looking for short-term gains. We have to look for long-term gains, and those are very large investors in the market, and they need to pay very close attention.
Let me add, if you take a look at the life expectancy of CEOs in corporate America, it's getting shorter every day, and they are being held accountable for things that nobody ever thought they would be held accountable before. So you have a plant and you get flooded out. It's not inconceivable all of a sudden the CEO is going to lose his or her job because they didn't take appropriate protection. Businesses have to assume the worst case, take protections for it, and hope it doesn't happen. And if they haven't prepared for the worst case, they better have a good retirement plan.
Mr. Chairman, one just quick insight with respect to Christine's question. when you think about a report like this, there are two ways that business can interpret and respond. One is to say, we should do something for our business about this, like set up reserves for insurance or set up reserves for power generation in the West or whatever. But assume that the problem is going to occur and then prepare to mitigate. That's one response. But I think what this report is calling for is a broader response, which is, what can we together as American business do about preventing some of the worst potential problems? How do we collectively respond so that some of what's projected can be staved off through the range of policy prescriptions that are being offered? And so often it takes the American business community, the middle class, people who have heretofore been indirectly involved to say, we have a big problem and we have to respond as a society. So I think there's a bigger call here than just businesses preparing for climate change.
I'll give you a very specific answer.
I'd
think
just
the
say one thing that is
SEC
hugely-
should include in its disclosure materiality requirements, disclosure of potential climate change effects, and if they...
Very specific,
Yeah.
not just vague.
No, I think, what are the emissions that you may be held accountable for someday? What are the assets that may be stranded someday? And what are the effects that a baseline, at the very least, if not tail risk, but at least a baseline climate change set of effects might have on your business? And if business had to disclose that, then that would become an incentive for business to act.
Yeah, we have this new organization, I think Mary Shapiro is, Antha, where are you? What's the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board? And we are going to try to have standards and measure it. And if you're going to do a prospectus for a new issue, you're going to have to come because people are going to say, that's one of the risks. I have to make sure I've considered it before I make an investment, or disclose it before I go to the public.
Any more answers from the risk committee on this? Do we have any more questions from press? Yes, sir.
Yeah, John Hurdle at Market News. I'd like to hear more from Mr. Steyer about what he means by by rewarding companies that take a more proactive line on climate policy and punishing those who don't.
Well, what I was really talking about is pretty much in line with the answers to the previous questions, which were a big part of this project has been to try and quantify risks, specifically by geography and industry. And what Mayor Bloomberg was talking about in terms of SASB is an attempt for specific quantification by company to quantify the risks they're taking in various ways with regards to energy and climate. So when Donna Shalala says long-term investors, pension investors, are going to have to take into account the potential impacts of this in their investments and to try and reward buy companies, pay more for companies which are, dealing with this in a responsible fashion. That's really what I'm talking about, is getting to a place where the calculation of the value of a company includes how they're handling this problem and how they're responding.
We're in competition with lots of other companies around the country and around the world for employees. And one of the things a lot of the kids that are getting out of school want to know, what are you doing about the environment? Are you responsive? They want to work for a company that is, and they don't want to work for a company that isn't. And that's an effect that you see every day. You don't have to wait for a long time for that one.
Other questions? One more question here, and then we're going to wrap up, and we have some availability after. Thanks.
Hi, Andrea Thompson from Climate Central. I'm wondering if any climate scientists were consulted or involved in the process of putting together this report.
This is actually a good question for Trevor Hauser, who brought together our expert team.
Great. So to conduct the research, we pulled together a team of climate scientists, economists, and private sector risk analysts. So our climate science team was led by Dr. Bob Kopp at Rutgers University. We also had an expert review panel composed of 16 climate scientists and economists. You can find that list on our website.
Thank you all.
Wait, you had a question in the back there?
Okay.
One last question over here.
Hi, I'm Ann Thompson. I'm from NBC News. My question to you is this, is what do you hope American businesses do with this report? Because I've been covering climate change and the environment for several years now. It seems that businesses, along with mayors like Mayor Bloomberg, and local leaders have been in the forefront of trying to do something about climate change. The drag has been the federal government. So are you hoping that businesses will take some action to spur the federal government to do something? What are you hoping this report actually does?
So, first of all, in my judgment, I believe in many ways businesses are ahead of at least the national government. I'm not sure they're ahead of city government. But as Henry Cisneros said, I think it's what we ultimately need is not just investment in resiliency to adapt to the outcomes we know are coming or are very likely to come. We need strong policy action to prevent the very worst outcomes. And I think that takes action by our national government. I don't think that can be done by business alone. So I think one of the things we're hoping is that a business will unite and be more active in pressing for policy change from the federal government. And then, I think everyone else, maybe the others want to respond, because I think we've all tried to answer the question in terms of what the sorts of things businesses should be doing and investors should be demanding of businesses.
And what kind of policy action are you looking for? Are you talking about a carbon tax?
Well, I think one of the really fundamental objectives we had here was to get together a bipartisan group that strongly agreed on one thing: the nature of the problem. Too often, and I can go after problem in our economy, people are busy arguing about tactics or fighting about what the solution is, and they haven't come together to agree on the problem first. So what we have is Republicans, Democrats, people from different backgrounds that all understand the problem, are united on the problem. We have different views in terms of what the right policy response is, and there's a variety of policy responses that make sense. But I do think we are in agreement that this takes a strong policy response from the national government.
Any other answers from the Risk Committee?
I'll give you one more shot at that. I deal with businesses a fair bit too because of the business side of my life. I think you're right. I think a lot of businesses are engaging in activities of one sort or another, but I think this needs to go to a whole different level where businesses, leaders of large businesses and small businesses, see this as an urgent issue, an immense danger to the economy that they're part of, and as a result, form a more of a coalescence, if you will, around the urgency of action and then engage with the federal government. And I don't think we're anything remotely like in that position right now, where this is sort of foremost in their minds with respect to the future of our economy and therefore of their businesses.
It's also true cities are where the real action has been. In New York City, in the last 5 years, we reduced our greenhouse gas emissions by 19% and put things in place that will reduce it even more. And if you want to know, am I committed? I own my company. I want to sleep at night. So we're doing some things so that I can do that. One of the things is, for example, we have a big computer room on Houston and Hudson, lower Manhattan, right on the Hudson River. We're moving it to upstate. I want to sleep at night. We're generating 70% of our own electricity. I want to sleep at night. We have more redundancy in our communications than anybody's ever put together, probably ever. I want to sleep at night. And that's exactly what people have to do. They got to understand it's for their well-being and that they can do something. And I couldn't agree more with Hank. Federal government has to do some things that cities and states can't. But there are people really making differences and leading the way. And now we've got to get the federal government to act.
Thank you very much, Mayor Bloomberg. I'm going to ask our guest if you could remain seated while the Risk Committee leaves the room. I do want to give Kate Gordon, the Executive Director of the Risky Business Project, a minute to say a couple words. Again, if you could remain seated while the Risk Committee goes back to the green room. We will be doing limited availability in that room. Most of you have already been in touch. Please contact me if you want to try to set the availability. Thanks very much. Kate?
Everyone, thank you so much for being here. Just very quickly on the question on business, which I think was answered really well by the Risk Committee. business has been great in addressing this issue from a very self-interested perspective, whether designing solutions to climate change or doing internal sustainability work. But what we haven't seen is business integrating these decisions into everyday investments and everyday decisions. Greg Page is a great example of a community that is doing that, the agricultural community. Henry Cisneros talked about the real estate community starting to integrate these climate risks into their everyday decisions. We haven't seen climate cross over into mainstream business decisions. It's mostly stayed in the sustainability room. And that's really what we were trying to get at with this report, was to say every long-term decision, every business decision that's being made, whether it's in the public sector or the private sector, needs to take climate change and climate risk into account. Thank you all so much for being here, and we're really looking forward to engaging with all of you more as we go forward with these results and a next round of research that we're looking forward to doing. Thank you.